clock just started. Good evening again. We start tonight with session 4 of our 7 sessions, if we will get there, about the 9th chapter of John's Gospel. Good evening to you all. It's been a busy time around here today. I've been spending actually a little bit more time with my boys today. I made soup tonight. I made first time took a ham shoulder and cut it up, and hominy. Never made ham and hominy soup before. Going out and hanging out with the Ojibwe singers at various wakes and events, we'd have hominy soup, and so I just thought, as we're kind of getting together and buckling down for the zombie apocalypse or the coronavirus apocalypse or shelter in place or whatever these terms that we're rapidly learning about in this awkward, strange time that we're in. What did we call that last night? Awkward, brave, and kind time that we're in. I'm trying new things, so went to the grocery store and stocked up. We're supposed to shelter in place here. And so we got frozen pizzas for the boys, and I'm trying to stay healthy, and so making a bunch of different soups. I really liked it, and if you're interested, message me and I'll send you my recipe. Ham and pork and hominy stew is what it was called. Anyway, tonight the curtain comes up on our 4th session on the man born blind and the miracle of Jesus healing and the sign of pointing to hope in what certainly seemed like a desperate time for the man. Scene 1 was actually the incident, the healing of the man, and Jesus was on the scene for just the very beginning of the story. Tonight we're going to be looking at verses 18 through 23. He's at the very beginning, the first scene, and then he disappears. Here we are in scene 4. He wasn't around for scene 2 when the blind man comes back from the pool of Siloam. He's washed his eyes after Jesus had placed the mud on his eyes. He's washed. He comes back home to his old neighborhood, but the neighbors don't quite know what to make of him. Is this the man who used to sit here and beg? The one that we're used to? And they're not sure what to do with this man. His life and his circumstances have changed. Last night we looked at scene 3 and how the neighbors then, when they don't know what to do with this man who is blind, they take him to the authorities. Going back, in the midst of when the neighbors in the neighborhood are saying, "How did you get your sight back? How did this happen? And where is this Jesus that healed you?" The man says, "I don't know." And that's a theme that goes throughout this whole chapter, is the blind man's not knowing, not the insight, not the vision. Even though he has the sight of eyes, he's developing in the midst of this difficult situation his faith, in the same way that we are, in the circumstances that we face right now. That faith is unfolding for him just as it is for us. And that vulnerability of being able to say, hey, I'm not sure where this is all going to take us. Am I concerned about the well-being of our church, of our community, certainly the well-being of our elders in the vulnerability that is faced by this? I watch the news and I see how this pandemic is, and the numbers of victims is growing exponentially, as it did in Italy, seems to be happening out on the East Coast, particularly in New York. There's a whole lot of, I don't know. And so the vulnerability of the blind man is refreshing. Last night I shared a quote from Brené Brown, who is somewhat known as a guru of vulnerability, if you will. This pandemic experience is a massive experiment in collective vulnerability. We can be our worst selves when we're afraid, or we can be our best, bravest selves. In the context of fear and vulnerability, there is often very little in between. Because when we are uncertain and afraid, our default is self-protection. And then she says, we don't have to be scary when we're scared. Let's choose awkward, brave, and kind. And let's choose each other. Well, the Pharisees, when they get wind of this, and the neighbors bring the blind man, the formerly blind man, to the Pharisees for an interrogation, because they want to go up the ladder, and they want to consult with the religious authorities and get a reading from them on what exactly is going on here. One thing to remember is when we talk about Pharisees or religious leaders of their time, we're not looking at a time of the separation of church and state. All that was collapsed, just like when we think of in Iran, a leader of a country who is the Ayatollah, the supreme religious ruler as well. In our Western democratic society, we've separated those two into church and state, but in Jesus' time, they're all one. So the priests were the arbiters, or the Pharisees were the arbiters of healing and the protectors from disease and plagues and famines. They were the ones who could determine whether or not one still had leprosy or some sort of a disease, and whether or not they were allowed back into to be a full functioning member of the community. So they were doctors, if you will. There were also, again, the religious leaders, the spiritual leaders. And thirdly, they were the legal authorities. They were the keepers of the law and the standards of, we hear the debate oftentimes, well, we should have the 10 Commandments on the grounds of our courthouse. Again, that's a desire to take kingdom of the left, kingdom of the right language and bring them together. But in Jesus' time, law, if you wanted to get a divorce, you went and you consulted with the priest. If you wanted a spiritual leadership, direction, encouragement, synagogue, worship, you went to the priest, the scribes, the Pharisees. And if you wanted to be healed, if you wanted a doctor to treat you, you went to the same group of people. So the neighborhood brought Jesus to the scribes and the Pharisees, or the Pharisees. And interestingly, I just talked about when we are uncertain, sometimes our default, as Brené Brown put it, is self-protection. And the Pharisees do a really interesting dance here. They're both the defense, their own defense. If somebody is in their neighborhood, on their doorstep, bringing sight to somebody who was born blind, providing and performing a miracle that's probably not in their bag of tricks. It certainly isn't. There's a threat there, and there's a need for self-protection. So in some ways, they are going to go after Jesus as a matter of their own defense. But there'll also be the prosecution. They want to accuse Jesus, as we'll find out here in a few minutes in a reading for tonight. They want to accuse Jesus of breaking the Sabbath. Their first witness is the man, he provides that damaging testimony right away when he explains how he's healed. He put mud on my eyes, the man says, then I washed, and now I see. And some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath. Jesus is guilty because he made mud. He kneaded bricks. The work of taking soil and mud and water and mixing it together on the Sabbath is a very explicitly written out in the Old Testament laws of the Levitical and Deuteronomical codes. This is something that is forbidden. So he can't be a man from God if he doesn't observe the Sabbath. And the man who was healed stumbles into that testimony and provides that damaging testimony that yes, indeed, Jesus was healing on the Sabbath. He was doing work. Tonight, the Pharisees call their second witness. They call the man's parents. Verse 18, the Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see? Again, the Pharisees are functioning like lawyers here. They're building a case, and the parents are the second set of witnesses to be called to the stand. How does he see? Are you sure this is your son? And his parents answered. They give their testimony. We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But we do not know how it is that he now sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself. Now, what's going on with these parents, huh? This wishy-washy, mamby-pamby response seems heartless. Shouldn't these parents just be overjoyed that their son can see? I mean, and that there's something to be absolutely overjoyed with in this situation. I subtitled our study for tonight, Meet the Parents, kind of taking off on that romantic comedy that's built around the whole bringing the boyfriend home to meet the parents sort of weekend and how that goes wrong. Well, the parents in this situation just seems to go terribly wrong. They don't even want to show that they love their child, that they're overjoyed that he can see. They're scared to the point where they say, well, don't tell us, go back and tell him. But at least they corroborate and they confirm the evidence that the man who was blind can see. That this man who can now see, even though they don't know how this miracle happened, yes, he is their son. We know that this is our son and that he was born blind. That's as far as we're willing to go, Junior. After that, dear old mom and dear old dad, they clam up. Ask him. He is of age. Ask him. He can speak for himself. So what's at stake here? Why? Why are the parents so fearful? Well, to use the Greek word for this, it's kind of one of those fun things you learn in seminary. Aposynagogas. Aposynagogas. To be put out of the synagogue. This is the first time in John's gospel that the dangerous sign of following Jesus means that you're going to be thrown out of your religious community. The Jewish community, the Pharisees, are not going to abide by kind of a, you can follow Jesus and you can follow us. No way. That's too much of a threat to them. The parents said he is of age, ask him. He can speak for himself because they were afraid of the Jews. For the Jews had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore, his parents said, he is of age, ask him. Dr. Caroline Lewis writes about what's at stake here. They are afraid that they will be aposynagogas, thrown out of the synagogue. This is the first reference to the specific consequences to Jesus' community for believing in him. Separation from their entire social, religious, and communal life. Members of families who chose to follow Jesus would be leaving their families for good. They would have been a complete break from every communal structure that constituted society in the ancient world. So again, if the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees, are the arbiters of who's in, who's out, not only on religious or spiritual grounds, but on legal grounds and on terms of community health. There's another piece that's lurking behind all of that, and that's the economic question. If you are ritually unclean, if the things that you sell and the products that you bring to market are not for Jewish consumption, okay, because you are aposynagogas and you've been thrown out, not just out of the synagogue, but out of all of the relationships of the people that are in the synagogue. We all know that, that church is full of a bunch of hypocrites, because all they do is they go there to make their business and to see and be seen and to build relationships. You've heard that mythology. I usually say to people, so you think that the church is full of hypocrites? There's always room for one more. But in particular, in that situation, everything in that society was lubricated by religious views, beliefs, and customs. The marketplace, and what you could eat and what you couldn't eat, when you could work, observance of the Sabbath and market, and what you could do and work in your fields, and what you could sell or not sell. Again, the law, and what was in and what was out, and what was right and what's wrong. Involvement in the synagogue, and health, all of that. So to follow Jesus is to be separated from all those dimensions of society. What's at stake here for us in this situation where we aren't necessarily thrown out of a society, but our lives and what our places of deep connection are definitely overturned right now. They're shaky. They're put into different balance. One of my favorite books is by David Brooks. He writes the book The Road to Character. Sorry, I don't have the cover on this one anymore. You're not going to be able to read that either. The Road to Character. In The Road to Character, David Brooks lays out 4 commitments that make up life. That these are the 4 things that we come into in our lives that make life meaningful. The number one thing that he lists is our spouse or our family. Those intimate connections, we've already heard that about meet the parents, and got to kind of wonder about the kind of parents that the blind man was raised with. What's the family dynamics there? Could do a psychological evaluation of John 9 and the relationship between the blind man and his parents. Our spouse, the person that we marry, and the family that we have and that we raise or are connected with is deeply a part of the very first commitment that we make. Interestingly, I preached a sermon on the 4 commitments on a confirmation Sunday here a couple of years ago. And Norris and Lila Stranlin, a couple in our congregation, I think they're celebrating like their 60th or 65th wedding anniversary that very same day. And so we had them stand and clapped and had a cake for them later after the church service during the coffee hour. And when I preached a sermon, I was talking about that commitment of a spouse and a marriage and a family. And I said to our confirmation students who are, 14, 15 years old, I said, you are more free than Norris and Lila are. Your lives have an infinite more number of possibilities because they're not as free. They've made a 65-year commitment to each other and a long-term commitment. The second of the 4 commitments is our commitment to our community. Where are we going to live? Are we going to live in Bagley, Minnesota? Are we going to live, for our family, we used to live in Walker. My hometown is Park Rapids, grew up in Moorhead. Those are all places that I've made commitments to and have made commitments to me. I'm sure you can understand that the place that I'm going to set down roots and the neighborhood and the people that I'm going to know are things of great value and great meaning. The third thing is often the thing that brings us into a community is our vocation. It's our work. What are we going to do for a living? And how do we, in the eyes of a fellow by the name of Frederick Buechner, he said this really well as an understanding of vocation is, what is our great gift and what is the world's great need? And true meaning is when our gift, our vocation, meets the world's great need. Or what's our great joy and what is the world's great sadness? And when those two come together, there's meaning and God-given purpose in that. Great joy, our great joy, meets the world's great sadness. The fourth commitment is, what is our guiding faith and our philosophy? What is the thing that guides us and gives us meaning day to day, particularly in a situation like we're facing right now, a global pandemic? What is the faith and the philosophy that will undergird our lives and our relationships, especially when those connections and those relationships seem to have shifted in a time of being in place for a while? David Brooks goes on to say the success and fulfillment of our lives depends upon how well we choose these commitments and then how well we execute upon them. That's a pretty heavy statement. The success and fulfillment of our lives depends upon how well we choose these four commitments. And when they seem threatened, and when they seem vulnerable, especially in a time like this, or when those commitments don't go deeply enough. The story of the man who built his house on sand and the man who built his house on rock is a nice and beautiful parable about exactly that kind of a commitment. I think it is not a time to try to latch on to some sort of a hard and fast certainty over and against others. It is a time to be, again, to use that terminology from Brené Brown, it is a time to be awkward, brave, and kind. All four of those commitments, spouse and family, community, vocation, strong guiding faith and philosophy, they're almost like a four-legged stool, and they hold up better the stronger that they are. Again, shelter in place may be a time when one or maybe even all four of those touch points in our lives are tested in a meaningful way. It brings me to another book I'd like to share with you tonight. It's a book called Grit by Angela Duckworth. The subtitle of the book, Grit, is The Power and Passion of Perseverance. This is a time for perseverance. It's a time to find and marshal those things, those energies, those strengths that you need to find in a time when God will give you the strength to choose them. Tell you a little bit about Dr. Duckworth, Angela Duckworth. In her 20s, Dr. Duckworth went to work for a global management consulting firm located in a skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan. She was a bright light, a hard charger, a steady riser in corporate America. And suddenly she left her job. She'd been working while she was in college and while she was working towards what ended up being a very unfulfilling career in mid-management and consulting. She worked towards that. She worked as a tutor in schools. And so she decided she wanted to go back to teaching. And she left the job to work as a 7th grade math teacher. God bless her. And so she traveled 6 subway stops below that Midtown skyscraper down to the Lower East Side of Manhattan. She writes, "The fall I started teaching there, our school was picked for the set of a movie about a rough and tumble school in a distressed urban neighborhood." As she worked with her students, 7th grade algebra students, some were quick studies, while others struggled with the rudimentary things of 7th grade math. fractions and decimals, and then the building blocks that lead you to algebra and geometry. She writes that by the end of the term, some of those quick studies, the bright students weren't doing as well as those who had to overcome their struggles. She found out that sometimes talent isn't enough, that toughness and grit trumps talent. There are 4 factors, according to Duckworth, that make up grit. Number 1 is interest, enjoying what you do. Number 2 is practice. That's the daily discipline of trying to do things better than you did them yesterday, or we did them yesterday. Number 3 is purpose. It's a sense that your work matters, that it makes a difference in the world. And again, in a situation like this of self-quarantine, of stay in place, does my work matter? Can be a question. And then the 4th one is hope, and I think this is a great one. Hope is rising to the occasion. It is rising to the occasion in which we find ourselves and finding hope even in the midst of the occasion that we've been given. I'm thoughtful of Romans chapter 5. We boast in our sufferings, gritty sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us because God's love has been poured into our hearts. Going back to that 3rd heading, there was interest, enjoying what you do, practice, the daily discipline of trying to do things better than we did them yesterday. 3, purpose, in the sense that your work matters. And 4, rising to the occasion, hope. Under the 3rd heading, Dr. Duckworth tells the story of Alex Scott. For some purpose comes first. That's that wanting to do something for the well-being of others, or that your work makes a difference. For some purpose comes first. This is the only way I can understand a paragon like Alex Scott. Ever since Alex could remember, she'd been sick. Her neuroblastoma had been diagnosed when she was a year old. Shortly after her 4th birthday, Alex told her mother, "When I get out of the hospital, I want to have a lemonade stand." She did. She operated her first lemonade stand before she turned 5, raising $2,000 for her doctors to, quote, help other kids like they helped me, unquote. When Alex passed away 4 years later, she'd inspired so many people to create their own lemonade stands that she'd raised more than $1 million. Alex's family has continued her legacy, and to date, Alex's Lemonade Stand Foundation has raised more than $100 million for cancer research. When I get out of the hospital, I want to have a lemonade stand. So when we get out of this situation, this quarantine or stay and shelter in place, what are we going to do? What kind of lemonade stand are you building right now in your mind? Looking ahead, Dr. Lewis will tell us about the blind man and how he will follow Jesus and he will find his purpose and his identity in him. The blind man will indeed be cast out apo sunagogos for his confession of who Jesus is. And that Jesus provides a community to those who have been expelled from their own is a major subtext of John's gospel. John chapter 9 will lead us into John chapter 10, where Jesus, the good shepherd, lays down his life for his sheep. My sheep hear my voice, and I lead them out. And the blind man, when he hears Jesus' voice and remembers that he is in the presence of his healer, we'll get to that soon, later in chapter 9, he knows who the good shepherd is. What is your guiding faith and philosophy in this difficult time? In this awkward, brave, and challenging time? Again, about vulnerability in the midst of that, and not trying to create some sort of a false sense of certainty. This pandemic experience is a massive experiment in collective vulnerability. We can be our worst selves when we're afraid, or we can be our very best selves. In the context of fear and vulnerability, there is often very little in between. Because when we are uncertain and afraid, our default is self-protection, kind of like those Pharisees. We don't have to be that way. We don't have to be scary when we're scared. Let's choose awkward, brave, and kind. Let's choose each other. Let us pray. Gracious God, again, we thank you for tonight and the opportunity to be together, even virtually as a community. Bless this night. What has been done has been done. What has not been done has not been done. All of this rests in you. Be with us night until we gather again tomorrow and do the work we have to do, imagining what lemonade stands we might build. In Jesus' name, amen.